ISCO expand KRO without heading 1400 words my in simple English words. Part 8. It should be interesting, and every part should be engaging so the audience doesn't get bored. Also keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI generated. Also don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. Also don't use names like Marcus, Sarah, Emma, Jamal, etc. Jake's alarm went off at 5 in the morning, but he was already awake. He had been lying in his narrow bed at the military quarters, staring at the ceiling and going over everything he had studied about British military protocol. Today was the day he would meet the Queen's Guard for the first time, and his stomach felt like it was doing backflips. The shower was ice cold, which actually helped wake him up completely. As he shaved, Jake looked at himself in the small mirror and took a deep breath. "You've got this," he whispered to his reflection. "You didn't come this far to mess it up now." His uniform was perfect. Every button gleamed, every crease was razor sharp, and his boots reflected the overhead lights like black mirrors. He had spent 2 hours the night before making sure everything was absolutely flawless. There would be no second chances to make. A first impression with these legendary soldiers, the bus ride to Wellington Barracks was quiet. Jake sat alone, watching London wake up around him. Regular people were heading to regular jobs, grabbing coffee and checking their phones, completely unaware that today would change the course of his military career forever. Wellington Barracks looked exactly like something out of a history book. The red brick buildings were old, but maintained with military precision. Everything was clean, orderly, and somehow intimidating. As Jake walked through the main gate, he could feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on him. Captain Reynolds was waiting for him in the main office. The British officer was tall and thin, with a mustache that looked like it belonged in an old war movie. His uniform was immaculate, and when he spoke, his accent was so proper it almost didn't sound real. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Captain Reynolds said, looking Jake up and down with sharp eyes. "I trust you slept well?" "Good, because from this moment forward, you'll be held to the same standards as every guardsman who has ever served Her Majesty. These standards have been built over 300 years, and they are not negotiable." Jake nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Yes, sir, I'm ready." "We shall see," the captain replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Follow me." The walk through the barracks was like a tour through living history. Jake passed rooms filled with uniforms that looked like they belonged in a museum, weapons that had been carried in battles he had only read about, and portraits of soldiers who had served kings and queens going back generations. The Coldstream Guards were formed in 1650, Captain Reynolds explained as they walked. "We are the oldest regiment in continuous active service in the British Army. We have fought at Waterloo, in both world wars and in every major conflict since our formation. The ceremonial duties you see at Buckingham Palace are just one small part of what we do." They entered a large training hall where Jake got his first look at the Queen's Guard in action. About 20 soldiers were practicing drill movements, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had thought he was good at ceremonial drill, but these men moved like machines. Every step was identical, every movement precise to the inch, every turn executed with mathematical perfection. "Impressive, isn't it?" Captain Reynolds said, noticing Jake's expression. "It takes years to reach this level. You'll be working primarily with Lance Corporal Bennett. He's one of our finest." Lance Corporal David Bennett was about Jake's age, maybe a year or two younger. He was average height with sandy brown hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When Captain Reynolds introduced them, Bennett's handshake was firm and his smile was genuine, but Jake could sense he was being evaluated. "American Marine, hey?" Bennett said, his accent thick with London working-class tones. "We've heard good things about your ceremonial skills. Hope you're ready for a proper challenge, mate." Jake grinned. "I didn't come all this way to embarrass myself." "Right then," Bennett laughed. "Let's see what you've got." The next hour was the hardest Jake had ever worked in his life. Bennett put him through drill movements that made his previous training look like children's games. The British style was different from what he was used to, more rigid, more precise, with timing that had to be perfect down to the split second. "Your rifle work is decent," Bennett said after watching Jake run through a basic routine. "But you're thinking too much. This has to be automatic, like breathing. When you're on duty at the palace, there are thousands of people watching your every move. Tourists with cameras, school children, dignitaries from around the world. You can't afford to think about what comes next. Your body has to know." They practiced for 3 hours straight. Jake's arms ached, his legs were shaking, and sweat was running down his back despite the cool morning air. But slowly he began to understand what Bennett meant. The movements started to flow together, becoming less like individual actions and more like a single, continuous dance. "Better," Bennett said, and Jake could hear real approval in his voice. "You're starting to get it." During the lunch break, Jake sat with Bennett and 3 other guardsmen in the mess hall. The food was surprisingly good, much better than what he was used to in Marine Corps' chow halls. But what impressed him more was the conversation. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up. Bennett had done 2 tours in Afghanistan. Guardsman Cooper had served in Iraq. Guardsman Price had been part of peacekeeping operations in Africa. They were combat veterans who happened to perform one of the most famous ceremonial duties in the world. "People think we're just for show," Bennett explained between bites of his sandwich. "They see the red uniforms and the funny hats and think we're some kind of tourist attraction. But every one of us is a fully trained soldier first. The ceremonial stuff is an honor we earn through military excellence." That afternoon, Bennett took Jake through the specific protocols for guard duty at Buckingham Palace. The rules were incredibly detailed and had been developed over generations. When to move, when to stay still, how to hold the rifle, where to look, how to react to tourists who got too close. Everything was planned and practiced until it became second nature. "The most important thing," Bennett said as they stood at attention in the practice area, "is that you never break character. No matter what happens around you, no matter how hot or cold it gets, no matter if tourists are taking pictures or children are crying or someone's trying to get your attention, you remain perfectly still and focused. You're not David Bennett or Jake Thompson when you're on duty, you're the Queen's Guard, and that means something." As the day wore on, Jake began to understand the incredible responsibility these men carried. They weren't just soldiers. They were living symbols of British tradition and military excellence. Every time they put on the uniform and took their positions at the palace, they were representing hundreds of years of history and honor. "Tomorrow," Bennett said as they finished the day's training, "you'll observe an actual changing of the guard. Ceremony, you won't participate yet, but you'll see how everything works in real time. And Thompson," he paused, his expression becoming serious, "remember that when you finally do take your position out there, you'll be representing not just the American Marines, but the friendship between our 2 nations. That's not a responsibility any of us take lightly." As Jake walked back to his quarters that evening, his mind was spinning with everything he had learned. The level of precision, dedication, and professionalism these soldiers maintained was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Tomorrow, he would see them in action for real, and soon after that, he would be standing beside them as an equal. He had no idea that in just a few days, he and Bennett would face a situation that would test everything they had trained for, and that their quick thinking would prevent what could have been an international incident. The morning sun was shining brightly over London as Jake stood in his dress uniform, checking his appearance one final time. After 5 days of intense training with Bennett and the other guards, today was his first official observation duty at Buckingham Palace. His heart was beating fast, but it was excitement now rather than nervousness. He felt ready. "Remember," Bennett said as they walked through the palace gates together, "you're not participating today, just watching and learning. Stay close to me and observe everything. The tourists, the other guards, the security personnel, the protocols. This is your chance to see how it all works together in real time." The morning ceremony had gone perfectly. Jake watched in amazement as the guards performed their intricate movements with clockwork precision. The tourists loved every second of it, snapping photos and cheering at the right moments. Everything was exactly as it should be. Now it was midday, and the palace courtyard was filled with the usual crowd of visitors from around the world. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers taking selfies, tour groups following guides who held colorful umbrellas high in the air. The atmosphere was cheerful and relaxed. Jake stood about 10 feet behind Bennett, who was at his post near the main gate. Even though he wasn't officially on duty, Jake maintained perfect military bearing. His training had taught him that he was always representing the Marines, whether he was actively serving or just observing. At first, everything seemed normal. The usual mix of tourists walked by, some stopping to take pictures, others just enjoying the famous sights of London. Children pointed excitedly at the guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. Parents smiled and took photos. It was exactly what Jake had expected, but then something caught his eye. A man in his 30s was standing near the edge of the crowd, about 30 yards away. He was wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather, and he kept checking his watch every few minutes. That alone wasn't unusual. Lots of tourists kept track of time when they were sightseeing. But there was something about the way he was moving that set off alarm bells in Jake's mind. The man would walk a few steps in one direction, stop, and look around, then walk back. He did this several times, always ending up in roughly the same spot. Each time he stopped, he would glance toward the palace gates, then down at a large backpack he was carrying, then back at his watch. Jake had spent 3 tours overseas, and he had developed a sixth sense for when something wasn't right. In Iraq and Afghanistan, being able to spot unusual behavior could mean the difference between life and death. The same instincts that had kept him alive in combat zones were now screaming that this man's behavior was wrong. The backpack was what really worried him. It was large, bulky, and the man kept checking on it like it contained something important. He would unzip the top slightly, peek inside, then zip it back up. His movements were quick and nervous, like someone who was carrying something they shouldn't be. Jake tried to dismiss his concerns at first. After all, this was London, not Baghdad. This was Buckingham Palace, one of the most secure locations in the world. Surely the palace security had everything under control. Maybe the man was just a nervous tourist who was late meeting his family or tour group. But as Jake continued to watch, the man's behavior became even more suspicious. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call, speaking in hushed tones while looking directly at the palace. Then he hung up and immediately moved to a different position, one that gave him a clearer view of the main entrance. Jake's military training kicked in completely. He began to study the man more carefully, noting every detail. Average height, brown hair, clean-shaven, wearing dark jeans and that oversized jacket. The backpack looked like it could hold a lot of weight, and from the way the man was carrying it, it definitely wasn't empty. What worried Jake most was the man's pattern of movement. He wasn't acting like a tourist at all. Tourists usually moved in groups, took lots of pictures, and spent time actually looking at the palace. This man was clearly focused on something else entirely. He was studying the security arrangements, the guard positions, the flow of people in and out of the area. Bennett, of course, couldn't turn his head to see what Jake was seeing. The guard's duty required him to remain perfectly still, eyes forward, completely focused on his ceremonial responsibilities. The tradition was sacred, and breaking it without an absolute emergency would be unthinkable. Jake found himself in an impossible situation. His instincts were telling him that something was seriously wrong, but he had no authority here. He was a guest, an observer, a Marine who was supposed to be learning British protocols, not making security decisions. If he was wrong about this man, if he caused an unnecessary panic or disrupted the ceremony over nothing, it could end his participation in the exchange program and embarrass the Marine Corps. But if he was right, and he did nothing. The man was now actively taking pictures, but not of the palace or the guards like other tourists. He seemed to be photographing the security cameras, the positions of the police officers, and the layout of the courtyard. Jake watched him take at least a dozen photos in rapid succession, each one focused on some aspect of the security arrangements rather than the tourist attractions. The man did something that made Jake's blood run cold. He walked directly toward one of the side entrances to the palace complex, the one used by staff and officials rather than tourists. He stood there for several minutes, appearing to count steps and study the entrance procedures. He even pulled out what looked like a small notebook and wrote something down. Jake's mind raced through his options. He could try to get the attention of one of the palace police officers, but they were positioned throughout the crowd and he couldn't leave his observation post without causing a scene. He could wait until after the ceremony and report what he had seen, but by then the man might be gone. Or he could break protocol and alert Bennett. Jake knew that asking Bennett to break his ceremonial stance would be asking him to violate centuries of tradition. The Queen's Guard simply did not move, did not react, did not acknowledge anything happening around them during their duty. It was one of the most famous aspects of their service, and tourists came from around the world specifically to see guards who remained perfectly motionless, no matter what happened around them. But Jake also knew that both he and Bennett were soldiers first, ceremonial guards second. If there was a real threat to public safety, surely that would override any ceremonial considerations. The man with the backpack was now walking in a deliberate pattern around the entire perimeter of the courtyard. He wasn't looking at the palace anymore. He was clearly studying the security setup. Jake watched him pause at several locations, always checking his watch, always glancing back at that backpack. Jake made his decision, moving slowly and carefully to avoid attracting attention from the tourist. Jake stepped closer to Bennett. He kept his military bearing perfect and his expression neutral, but he managed to position himself where Bennett could see him in his peripheral vision. "Bennett," Jake said in a voice so low it was barely a whisper. "Don't react, don't move. But there's a suspicious individual at your 2 o'clock position. Dark jacket, large backpack, been photographing security arrangements for the past 10 minutes. For a moment, Bennett gave no sign that he had heard anything. His military training was too strong, his discipline too complete. But Jake could see the slightest change in his posture, the tiniest shift that indicated Bennett was now aware of the potential threat. What happened next would test everything both men had learned about duty, protocol, and making split-second decisions under pressure. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were about to become part of a story that would be talked about for years to come. The seconds that followed Jake's whispered warning felt like hours. Bennett remained perfectly still, his rifle held at the precise angle required by 3 centuries of tradition. To any tourist watching, nothing had changed. But Jake could see the subtle signs that Bennett was now fully alert, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had become more controlled, the almost invisible shift in his stance that indicated a soldier ready for action. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone around him could hear it. He had just asked a Queen's Guard to break protocol during ceremonial duty. In the military world, this was like asking someone to commit professional suicide. Guards had stood motionless through thunderstorms, tourist incidents, even medical emergencies. The tradition was sacred, and what Jake had just suggested went against everything Bennett had been trained to do. The suspicious man was still moving around the courtyard, but his behavior was becoming even more concerning. He had pulled out his phone again and was now holding it up, not like someone taking vacation photos, but like someone conducting surveillance. The camera was pointed directly at the guard positions, the police locations, and the various entrances to the palace complex. Jake watched as the man made another phone call. This time, the conversation was longer and more animated. The man kept pointing toward different areas of the courtyard while he talked, as if he was giving directions or describing locations to whoever was on the other end of the line. When he hung up, he immediately checked his backpack again, unzipping it slightly and peering inside with the kind of nervous intensity that made Jake's combat instincts scream danger. A family with 3 young children walked past Bennett, and the kids were fascinated by the guard's colorful uniform and tall hat. They posed for pictures with their parents, laughing and pointing, completely unaware of the tension building just a few feet away. Jake found himself thinking about those children, about all the innocent people in the courtyard who had come to London For a fun day of sightseeing, the suspicious man was now walking in a very deliberate pattern, moving from one specific location to another like he was following some kind of predetermined route. Each stop seemed carefully chosen, places where he could see different angles of the palace security, different vantage points that would give him information about how the protection systems worked. Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life if he was wrong. Moving with the careful precision he had learned during his years as a Marine, Jake took one small step to his left. To anyone watching, it would look like a minor adjustment of position, nothing more, but it placed him directly in Bennett's line of sight. Then, using the hand position techniques they had practiced during training, Jake made a series of subtle gestures that he hoped Bennett would understand. First, he pointed slightly with his eyes toward the suspicious man's location. Then, he used a small hand movement behind his back to indicate the potential threat. Finally, he made the slightest nod toward the nearest palace security officer, a plainclothes agent who was positioned about 20 yards away near a group of tourists for what felt like an eternity. Bennett gave no response. Jake began to worry that his message hadn't been understood, or worse, that Bennett was choosing to ignore it in favor of maintaining protocol. The guard's face remained completely expressionless, his posture unchanged, his focus apparently still fixed straight ahead. But then, something extraordinary happened. In a movement so small that only someone trained in military observation would notice it, Bennett shifted his weight slightly from his left foot to his right. It was a signal they had practiced during training, a way for guards to communicate with each other without breaking their ceremonial stance. The movement meant message received and understood. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by renewed anxiety. Bennett had acknowledged the threat, but what could he do about it? The guard was bound by protocols that had been developed over generations. He couldn't simply abandon his post or break his ceremonial stance without causing an international incident. The suspicious man was now directly in front of the main palace entrance, studying the metal detectors and security checkpoints that visitors had to pass through. He was taking notes again, writing quickly in his small notebook while glancing around to make sure no one was watching him. But Jake was watching, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The man pulled a small device from his pocket, something that looked like a cell phone but with an unusual antenna. He held it up toward the palace security systems, moving it slowly, from side to side like he was scanning for something. Jake had seen similar devices during his military service. They were used to detect electronic signals, security frequencies, and communication systems. This wasn't just a tourist behaving strangely. This was someone conducting active surveillance of one of the most secure locations in the world. Bennett must have seen it too, because Jake noticed the guard's breathing pattern change. Still maintaining his perfect ceremonial posture, Bennett was now fully engaged, his military training overriding his ceremonial duties. Jake could practically see the calculations happening in the guard's mind: threat assessment, response options, protocols for emergency situations. Then Bennett did something that would be talked about in military circles for years to come, without moving his head, without changing his facial expression, without giving any outward sign that he was doing anything other than performing his ceremonial duty. Bennett made eye contact with Jake. It was brief, maybe half a second, but it was unmistakable. In that moment, two soldiers from different countries, trained in different traditions, made a silent agreement to put public safety above protocol, using the same subtle communication techniques they had been taught. Bennett indicated his intention to alert the palace security, but he needed Jake to help coordinate the response without causing panic among the hundreds of tourists in the courtyard. Jake nodded almost imperceptibly and began to move, still maintaining his military bearing, still looking like nothing more than an American observer taking in the sights. He began to position himself where he could signal the nearest security officer. The plainclothes agent was a woman in her 40s, wearing casual tourist clothes, but with the alert posture that marked her as law enforcement. She was positioned near a large tour group, blending in perfectly with the crowd while keeping a watchful eye on everything happening in the courtyard. Jake knew he had to be careful. If he approached her too directly or too obviously, it might alert the suspicious man that he had been spotted. But if he was too subtle, she might not understand the urgency of the situation. Moving with the same precision he had used in combat zones, Jake began to walk slowly toward the security officer's position. He kept his pace casual, stopping occasionally to look at the palace architecture like any tourist would do. But with each step, he was getting closer to being able to communicate the threat. The suspicious man was now walking back toward the area where Bennett was stationed. As he approached, Jake could see him studying the guard's position, taking more photos, and making additional notes. The man's behavior was becoming more bold, more obvious, like someone who was running out of time to complete his mission. Jake reached the security officer's area just as the suspicious man walked past Bennett's position for the third time. This time, the man stopped directly in front of the guard and stared at him for several long seconds, as if testing whether Bennett would react to his presence. Bennett remained perfectly motionless, but Jake could see the tension in every line of his body. The guard was coiled like a spring, ready to act if the situation escalated, but still maintaining the discipline that had made the Queen's Guard legendary. It was time to act. Jake caught the security officer's eye and made the subtle hand signals that identified him as military personnel with important information. The woman's expression didn't change, but Jake could see recognition in her eyes. She understood that something serious was happening. What happened next would test everything. Both men had learned about duty, courage, and making the right choice when the stakes were highest. The moment Jake made eye contact with the plainclothes security officer, he knew there was no turning back. Agent Kelly Morrison had been working palace security for 8 years, and she had learned to read body language like other people read books. The American Marine standing 30 feet away was trying to tell her something important, and his military posture told her it wasn't a casual tourist question. Jake used the subtle hand signals he had learned during his overseas deployments. A slight gesture toward the suspicious man, a quick tap near his chest to indicate a potential threat, and a small movement of his fingers to show urgency. To anyone else watching, it would look like a tourist adjusting his jacket. But Agent Morrison understood immediately. She began moving through the crowd with practiced ease, never walking in a straight line toward Jake, always appearing to be just another visitor enjoying the sights. As she got closer, Jake could see her speaking quietly into a small microphone hidden in her jacket collar. Backup was already being called. The suspicious man seemed completely unaware that he had been spotted. He was now standing about 15 feet from Bennett, holding up his electronic device again and pointing it directly at the guard post. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to have found it, because he suddenly became very excited and started writing furiously in his notebook. Jake positioned himself where he could observe both the suspicious man and Agent Morrison. His military training had taught him to always have multiple escape routes and to be aware of everything happening around him. Right now, that training was screaming that something big was about to happen. American Marine? Agent Morrison said quietly as she approached, her voice so low that only Jake could hear her. She was still smiling and looking around like a tourist, but her eyes were sharp and focused. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied, keeping his own voice just as quiet. Staff Sergeant Thompson, here on exchange with the Queen's Guard. I've been observing a suspicious individual for the past 15 minutes. Dark jacket, large backpack, conducting what appears to be surveillance of your security arrangements. Agent Morrison's expression didn't change, but Jake could see her body language shift slightly. She was now in full alert mode, processing the information and making rapid decisions about how to respond. Has he made any threatening moves toward the guards or civilians? She asked. Not directly, but he's been photographing security cameras, guard positions, and entrance procedures. He's also been using some kind of electronic scanning device. I've seen similar equipment used for reconnaissance in combat zones. That got her attention. Agent Morrison's eyes flicked toward the suspicious man, who was now walking toward one of the side entrances to the palace complex. He was moving with more purpose now, like someone who had completed one phase of a mission and was moving on to the next. Stay here and keep eyes on him, Agent Morrison instructed. Do not approach or engage. We have teams moving into position now. Jake nodded and watched as the agent melted back into the crowd. Within seconds, he began to notice other changes in the courtyard. A maintenance worker who had been cleaning near the main gate suddenly stopped working and began walking in the direction of the suspicious man. A couple who had been taking photos near the gift shop started moving through the crowd. With more purpose than typical tourists would have, palace security was responding, but they were doing it so smoothly and professionally that the hundreds of other visitors had no idea anything was happening. Jake found himself impressed by their coordination and skill. Bennett, meanwhile, was still maintaining his perfect ceremonial stance, but Jake could see the tension in his posture. The guard had to be aware that something was developing around him, but his training and discipline kept him focused on his duty. Jake wondered how difficult it must be to remain motionless when every military instinct was telling him to act. The suspicious man had reached the side entrance and was now openly photographing the security checkpoint. He seemed to have lost all caution, taking pictures from multiple angles and making detailed notes about the procedures he was observing. His behavior was becoming so obvious that some of the other tourists were starting to notice and point. That's when things began to happen very quickly. Jake saw Agent Morrison speak into her microphone again, and suddenly there were security personnel moving from multiple directions. They were still being discreet, still trying not to alarm the general public, but Jake's trained eye could see at least 6 officers closing in on the suspicious man's position. The man must have finally realized he was being watched because he suddenly stopped taking pictures and looked around nervously. When he saw the maintenance worker approaching from one direction and the tourist couple from another, his face went pale and he started backing away from the entrance, but he had waited too long to run. Agent Morrison appeared directly behind him, along with 2 uniformed palace police officers who seemed to materialize out of nowhere. "Excuse me, sir," Agent Morrison said in a voice that was polite but firm. "Could we have a word with you, please?" The man's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of cooperating or trying to explain his behavior, he dropped his backpack and started running toward the main crowd of tourists. Jake watched in shock as the man pushed through a group of elderly visitors from Japan, causing several of them to stumble and cry out in alarm. Now the situation was becoming a public incident. Children started crying, tourists began backing away from the commotion, and people started pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The peaceful atmosphere of the palace courtyard was suddenly filled with confusion and fear. Jake found himself in an impossible position. His instincts told him to pursue the fleeing suspect, but he had no authority here and his involvement could create an international incident. He was supposed to be an observer, learning British protocols, not participating in security operations, but then he saw where the man was running. The suspect was heading directly toward a group of schoolchildren who were on a field trip to the palace. About 20 kids, maybe 8 or 9 years old, were standing with their teachers near the main entrance, completely unaware of the danger approaching them. The man was running at full speed, panic evident in his every movement, and he was going to crash right into the children. Jake didn't think. He just reacted. Breaking into a sprint. Jake intercepted the fleeing man just before he reached the school group. The tackle was clean and professional, bringing the suspect down without injury but stopping his escape completely. The 2 men hit the ground hard, with Jake using his training to control the fall and prevent the suspect from getting back up. "Stay down," Jake commanded, using the voice he had developed during years of military service. "Do not move." The suspect struggled for a moment, then seemed to realize how hopeless his situation was. Palace security officers surrounded them within seconds, taking control of the situation with smooth professionalism, but the damage was done. The incident had become very public, with dozens of tourists filming everything on their phones. Jake could see the headlines already: American Marine tackles, suspect at Buckingham Palace, or security incident disrupts Royal Guard ceremony. As the security officers helped Jake to his feet and took the suspect into custody, Jake's eyes found Bennett. The guard was still at his post, still maintaining his ceremonial stance, But Jake could see something different in his expression. Pride, maybe, or approval. Even though Bennett couldn't acknowledge what had happened, Jake knew the guard understood that the right choice had been made. Agent Morrison approached Jake as the suspect was being led away. "Thank you," she said simply. "You may have prevented a serious incident." Jake nodded, but he was already thinking about the consequences of his actions. He had just tackled a suspect on the grounds of Buckingham Palace while representing the United States Marine Corps. There would be questions, investigations, and probably a lot of paperwork. What he didn't know was that his actions and Bennett's decision to break protocol to alert security had just prevented what could have been a much more serious situation. The investigation that would follow would reveal just how dangerous the man they had helped catch really was. The moment Jake helped restrain the fleeing suspect, everything changed at Buckingham Palace. What had started as a routine ceremonial day suddenly became a complex security situation that would require immediate and careful handling. Jake could feel the eyes of hundreds of tourists on him as he stood up, brushing dirt from his uniform while palace security officers took control of the arrested man. Agent Morrison was speaking rapidly into her radio, using codes and terminology that Jake couldn't understand but recognized as emergency protocols. Within seconds, the entire atmosphere in the courtyard shifted from casual tourism to controlled crisis management. More security personnel appeared from seemingly nowhere, their movements coordinated and purposeful. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Agent Morrison said, approaching Jake with a serious expression. "I need you to come with me immediately. There are procedures we must follow when foreign military personnel become involved in palace security incidents." Jake nodded, understanding that his status as an American Marine on British soil complicated everything. He wasn't just a tourist who had helped stop a suspicious person. He was a representative of the United States military, who had taken action on the grounds of one of Britain's most important royal residences. As they began walking toward the palace, Jake caught sight of Bennett still at his ceremonial post. The guard's face remained perfectly composed, showing no emotion or acknowledgement of what had just occurred. But Jake could see something in Bennett's eyes, concern, perhaps, or solidarity. Even though Bennett couldn't break his stance to show support, Jake knew his friend was worried about what would happen next. "What about Bennett?" Jake asked Agent Morrison quietly. "He was the one who helped identify the threat in the first place. Lance Corporal Bennett will be debriefed separately," she replied. "Right now, our priority is getting you to a secure location for questioning. The fact that you physically intervened in this situation creates certain ... complications." Jake began to understand the seriousness of his position. By tackling the suspect, he had crossed a line from observer to participant. In the world of international diplomacy and military relations, such actions could have far-reaching consequences. He might have prevented a dangerous situation, but he had also created a potential diplomatic incident. They were joined by two more security officers, a tall man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Inspector Williams and a woman in military uniform who identified herself as Major Crawford from the British Army Liaison Office. Their presence made it clear that this was no longer just a security matter, but something that involved multiple government agencies. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Inspector Williams said as they walked, "I want you to understand that you are not under arrest or being detained. However, given the circumstances, we need to conduct a thorough debriefing to understand exactly what occurred and why you felt it necessary to intervene." The tourists in the courtyard were watching their group with intense curiosity. Jake could see people pointing and taking pictures with their phones, no doubt wondering why an American Marine was being escorted away by British security. He tried to maintain his military bearing and dignity, but inside he was starting to worry about the implications of his actions. "Am I in trouble?" Jake asked directly. "I saw a potential threat to civilians and I reacted. In my training, protecting innocent people comes before everything else." Major Crawford spoke up for the first time. "Your instincts were admirable, Staff Sergeant, and preliminary evidence suggests your concerns about the suspect were justified. However, the protocols for foreign military personnel operating on British soil are complex, and we need to ensure that all proper procedures are followed. As they approached a side entrance to the palace, Jake realized how this must look to the watching crowd. A U.S. Marine being escorted away by multiple security officers after tackling someone on palace grounds? It was the kind of scene that would make international news within hours. He could already imagine the phone calls between Washington and London, the meetings between military commanders, and the diplomatic discussions about what had actually happened. The entrance they used was clearly not for tourists. It was a secure checkpoint with metal detectors, X-ray machines, and multiple layers of security personnel. Jake noticed that every officer they passed looked at him with professional interest, not hostility, but the kind of attention reserved for someone who had become part of an important security incident. "My phone," Jake said suddenly, realizing he should probably contact his commanding officer. "Should I call my unit and let them know what's happening?" "That won't be necessary just yet," Inspector Williams replied. "We've already been in contact with the appropriate American military authorities. Your commanding officer has been notified that you're assisting with a security investigation, and he's been assured of your safety and well-being." Jake felt a mix of relief and anxiety. At least his unit wouldn't be wondering where he was. But the fact that high-level communications were already happening suggested this incident was being taken very seriously by both governments. They entered a corridor that Jake had never seen during his training visits. The walls were lined with portraits of former royal family members and military officials, and everything spoke of history and tradition. But there was also modern security equipment. Everywhere, cameras, sensors, and technology that Jake recognized from high-security military installations. "Where exactly are we going?" Jake asked as they continued down the corridor. "To a secure briefing room where we can discuss what you observed and why you took the actions you did," Major Crawford explained. "We need to understand the complete timeline of events, from when you first noticed the suspect to when you decided to physically intervene." Jake realized they were treating this like a military operation debriefing, which made sense given the circumstances. Every detail would be important, every decision would be analyzed, and every action would be evaluated for its appropriateness and effectiveness. As they walked, Jake began to think about Bennett, who was still standing at his post in the courtyard. The guard had made an extraordinary decision to break centuries of protocol to help identify a potential threat. That decision had ultimately led to the suspect being caught, but it had also put Bennett's career at risk. Jake hoped his friend wouldn't face serious consequences for doing the right thing. They passed several more security checkpoints, each one requiring identification and clearance. Jake noticed that his escorts were treated with obvious respect by the security personnel, suggesting they held significant authority within the palace security structure. "Staff Sergeant," Inspector Williams said as they approached a heavy wooden door, "before we begin the formal debriefing, I want you to know that initial reports suggest you may have prevented a serious security breach." The suspect was carrying equipment that could have been used to compromise palace security systems. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. If the suspect had actually been planning something dangerous, then his decision to act would be seen much more favorably. But he also knew that the investigation was just beginning, and there would be many questions about why an American Marine had ended up tackling someone on the grounds of Buckingham Palace. The door opened to reveal a room that looked like something from a spy movie. There were multiple screens showing security camera feeds, communication equipment, and a large conference table surrounded by comfortable chairs. Several people were already waiting inside, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes, all with the bearing of individuals accustomed to handling serious situations. "Gentlemen, ladies," Major Crawford announced as they entered, "this is Staff Sergeant Jake Thompson, the American Marine who identified and apprehended the suspect." Jake found himself being studied by some of the most senior security officials in the British government. Their expressions were professional but not unfriendly, and he sensed that they were genuinely interested in hearing his account of what had happened. "Please have a seat," Inspector Williams said, gesturing to a chair. at the conference table. We have quite a bit to discuss, and I suspect this is going to be a very interesting conversation. As Jake sat down, he realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. What had started as a routine day of observation and learning had become something that would likely be remembered and talked about for years to come. The secure briefing room felt like the kind of place where important decisions were made and secrets were kept. Jake sat at the polished wooden table, surrounded by officials whose calm demeanor couldn't hide the seriousness of the situation. The walls were lined with monitors showing live feeds from security cameras throughout the palace grounds, and Jake could see Bennett still at his ceremonial post, maintaining perfect military bearing despite everything that had happened. Detective Chief Inspector Roberts, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and graying hair, took the lead in the questioning. She had the kind of presence that commanded respect without being intimidating, and Jake could tell she had been handling serious security matters for many years. Staff Sergeant Thompson, she began, opening a thick folder filled with documents. Let's start from the beginning. What time did you first notice the suspect, and what specifically caught your attention about his behavior? Jake took a deep breath and began recounting everything he had observed. He described the man's unusual movement patterns, the way he kept checking his backpack, the photographs he was taking of security equipment rather than tourist attractions, and the electronic device that had set off every alarm bell in Jake's military-trained mind. You mentioned that you recognized the scanning device, Major Crawford interjected. Can you describe your experience with similar equipment? During my deployment in Iraq, we encountered insurgents using electronic surveillance tools to map our security frequencies and communication systems, Jake explained. The device this man was using looked very similar to equipment we had confiscated from enemy operatives. The room fell silent as the officials exchanged meaningful glances. Jake sensed that his identification of the scanning device was more significant than he had initially realized. Detective Roberts made several notes before continuing. Tell us about your decision to alert Lance Corporal Bennett. You understood that asking him to break ceremonial protocol was asking him to violate centuries of tradition. Jake nodded. I did understand that, ma'am. But I also knew that both Bennett and I are soldiers first, ceremonial guards second. If there was a genuine threat to public safety, I believe that would override any ceremonial considerations. And how did Lance Corporal Bennett respond to your alert? He acknowledged my warning through subtle military signals, then helped coordinate our response to ensure palace security was notified without causing panic among the tourists. Inspector Williams leaned forward with interest. The coordination between you and Lance Corporal Bennett was quite remarkable, especially considering you've only been training together for a few days. How did you manage such effective communication? Without verbal contact? Jake found himself smiling slightly, despite the seriousness of the situation. Bennett is an exceptional soldier, sir. We had practiced silent communication techniques during my training, and when the situation required we fell back on our shared military experience. Good soldiers understand each other, regardless of which country they serve. The questions continued for over an hour, with the officials asking for increasingly specific details about everything Jake had observed. They wanted to know exact times, precise locations, detailed descriptions of the suspect's equipment, and step-by-step accounts of how the situation had developed. During a brief break, Detective Roberts stepped out of the room to take a phone call. When she returned, her expression was noticeably more serious. Staff Sergeant Thompson, she said, settling back into her chair, we've just received preliminary results from our examination of the suspect's equipment. Your assessment was correct. He was carrying sophisticated surveillance gear designed to intercept security communications and map electronic defense systems. Jake felt a mixture of vindication and concern. He had been right about the threat, but that also meant the situation had been more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. What was he planning to do with that information? Jake asked. Major Crawford answered. We're still investigating, but it appears he was conducting reconnaissance for a larger operation. The notes found in his possession suggest he was gathering intelligence for a group planning to exploit security vulnerabilities. at multiple high-profile locations in London. The weight of that revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. If he and Bennett hadn't acted when they did, the suspect might have completed his surveillance mission and provided critical security information to people with harmful intentions. There's something else, Detective Roberts continued. The suspect has been identified as Trevor Mitchell, a freelance journalist with a history of selling sensitive information to questionable sources. He's been on our watch list for several months, but we hadn't been able to connect him to any specific illegal activities until today. Jake realized that his military instincts had been more accurate than he had dared to hope. The man hadn't just been acting suspiciously, he had been conducting actual intelligence gathering for criminal purposes. What happens now? Jake asked. To Mitchell, to the investigation, and ... he hesitated. To Bennett and me? Inspector Williams smiled for the first time since the meeting had begun. Mr. Mitchell will be charged with several serious offenses related to unauthorized surveillance and potential terrorist activities. The investigation will continue as we work to identify and locate his associates. As for you and Lance Corporal Bennett, Major Crawford added, that's a more complex matter. What you did today was commendable, but it also created some unusual circumstances that need to be addressed at the highest levels of both our governments. Jake's heart sank. Are we in trouble? Detective Roberts shook her head. On the contrary, Staff Sergeant, you may have prevented a significant security breach that could have had serious consequences for public safety. However, the fact that a foreign military officer took direct action on British soil requires careful diplomatic handling. Over the next 2 hours, Jake was interviewed by officials from multiple agencies. Representatives from the American Embassy asked about his training and background. British military officers wanted to understand the communication methods he had used with Bennett. Intelligence analysts questioned him about his recognition of the surveillance equipment. Throughout it all, Jake found himself thinking about Bennett, who was still at his ceremonial post, unable to defend his own actions or explain his decision to break protocol. The guard had made a split-second choice to trust Jake's assessment and help coordinate a response, and now his career might be in jeopardy because of it. What will happen to Lance Corporal Bennett? Jake asked during one of the brief breaks in questioning. He only broke protocol because I alerted him to a potential threat. If anyone should face consequences, it should be me. Major Crawford's expression softened slightly. Lance Corporal Bennett is being debriefed separately, but I can tell you that his actions are being viewed very favorably by his commanding officers. He demonstrated excellent judgment under unusual circumstances. As the afternoon wore on, Jake began to understand that this incident was being treated as a significant success for palace security, despite the irregular way it had unfolded. The cooperation between an American Marine and a British Guard had prevented what could have been a serious intelligence breach. One final question, Detective Roberts said as the formal interview seemed to be winding down. If you found yourself in a similar situation again, would you make the same choices? Jake didn't hesitate. Absolutely, ma'am. The safety of innocent civilians has to come first, regardless of protocol or diplomatic considerations. That's what both the Marine Corps and the Queen's Guard stand for. The officials exchanged glances that Jake couldn't quite interpret, but he sensed that his answer had been exactly what they wanted to hear. Thank you, Staff Sergeant Thompson, Inspector Williams said, standing up. You've been very helpful, and your actions today reflect credit on both yourself and the United States Marine Corps. As they prepared to escort Jake from the briefing room, Detective Roberts made one final comment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Staff Sergeant, she said, in my 25 years of security work, I've rarely seen such effective cooperation between Allied forces under pressure. You and Lance Corporal Bennett have set a new standard for international military collaboration. Jake left the briefing room not knowing what consequences might still await him, but confident that he and Bennett had done the right thing when it mattered most. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and Jake was beginning to think the whole situation had been quietly forgotten. He had returned to his regular training with the Queen's Guard, and Bennett had resumed his ceremonial duties without any apparent consequences. The media attention had died down after a few days, and life seemed to be getting back to normal. Jake spent his mornings practicing drill movements and his afternoons learning about British military history. The other guards treated him with the same respect and friendship they had shown before, and Bennett continued to be an excellent teacher and mentor. If anything, their shared experience had strengthened their bond as soldiers and friends, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The investigation into Trevor Mitchell and his associates was ongoing, and Jake had been told to expect follow-up interviews. More importantly, he worried that the diplomatic implications of his actions were still being debated in government offices on both sides of the Atlantic. On a gray Thursday morning, Captain Reynolds appeared at the training hall with an unusual expression on his face. Jake had learned to read the captain's moods over the past few weeks, and this was something he hadn't seen before, a mixture of formality and barely contained excitement. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Captain Reynolds said, his voice carrying the kind of weight that meant something important was about to happen. "You're to report to the commanding officer's office immediately." "And Thompson?" He paused, adjusting his already perfect uniform. "You might want to ensure your dress uniform is absolutely pristine." Jake felt his stomach drop. After 3 weeks of uncertainty, this could be the moment when he learned his fate. Had his actions caused diplomatic problems that couldn't be resolved quietly? Was he being sent back to the United States in disgrace? Or worse, was he facing some kind of formal disciplinary action? Bennett, who had been practicing nearby, caught Jake's eye and gave him an encouraging nod. "Whatever this is," Bennett said quietly, "remember that you did the right thing. That counts for something." Jake spent the next hour making sure every detail of his uniform was perfect. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, every button gleamed like silver, and his ribbons and insignia were positioned with mathematical precision. If this was going to be the end of his exchange program, he was determined to face it looking like the Marine he was proud to be. The walk to the commanding officer's office felt like the longest of Jake's military career. He passed through corridors he had come to know well, nodded to guards he had trained with, and tried to prepare himself for whatever was waiting behind that imposing wooden door. Colonel Harrison was a legend in the British Army, a man whose career spanned 3 decades and multiple conflicts. Jake had met him briefly when he first arrived in London, but this was only the second time he had been called to the colonel's office. The first time had been a welcome meeting. This felt very different. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Harrison said as Jake entered and came to attention. "Please, have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss." The colonel's office was filled with military memorabilia, photographs of royal family members, and awards that represented a lifetime of distinguished service. But what caught Jake's attention was the presence of several other people in the room: Major Crawford, Captain Reynolds, and 2 men in civilian clothes whom Jake didn't recognize. "Staff Sergeant," Colonel Harrison began, "I'm sure you've been wondering about the aftermath of the incident 3 weeks ago. I want to begin by telling you that the investigation has concluded, and the results have been quite remarkable." Jake remained silent, waiting for whatever was coming next. "Trevor Mitchell has been charged with multiple serious offenses," one of the civilian officials said. "More importantly, the intelligence gathered from his equipment and associates has led to the disruption of a network planning coordinated attacks on several high-profile locations throughout London." Jake felt as though the wind had been knocked out of him. "You mean there really was a larger plot?" "Indeed," Colonel Harrison replied. "Mitchell was part of a group that had been planning to exploit security vulnerabilities at Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, and the Tower of London. The surveillance he was conducting was the final phase of their reconnaissance. If you and Lance Corporal Bennett hadn't intervened when you did, they might have obtained the information needed to carry out their plans." The weight of that revelation was staggering. Jake had followed his instincts and training, but he had never imagined the true scope of what they had prevented. "The cooperation between you and Lance Corporal Bennett has been studied extensively," Major Crawford added. "Your ability to communicate and coordinate under pressure. despite coming from different military traditions, has impressed everyone who has reviewed the incident. What does this mean for Bennett and me? Jake asked. Are we in any kind of trouble for breaking protocol? Colonel Harrison smiled for the first time since Jake had entered the room. On the contrary, Staff Sergeant. Both of your governments have decided that your actions deserve recognition, not censure. One of the civilian officials opened a briefcase and removed several official-looking documents. The Prime Minister has personally reviewed this case, he said. She has requested that both you and Lance Corporal Bennett be commended for your service to the United Kingdom. Jake stared in disbelief. The Prime Minister knows about this? Indeed she does, Colonel Harrison replied. And she's not the only. 1. Your actions have been brought to the attention of senior officials in both the British and American governments. Captain Reynolds stepped forward with a formal document bearing official seals and signatures. Staff Sergeant Thompson, by order of Her Majesty's Government, you are hereby awarded the Queen's Commendation for valuable service, in recognition of your vigilance, courage, and outstanding cooperation with British security forces in preventing a potential terrorist attack. Jake felt as though he was in a dream. A few weeks ago, he had been worried about embarrassing the Marine Corps by breaking diplomatic protocol. Now he was receiving one of Britain's highest civilian honors. But that's not all, Colonel Harrison continued. Your commanding officer in the United States has been in constant communication with us throughout this process. He has informed us that you are being recommended for the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for your actions. The room seemed to spin around Jake as he tried to process what he was hearing. Not only was he not in trouble, but he was being honored by both countries for doing what he believed was right. What about Bennett? Jake asked. He took just as much risk as I did when he broke ceremonial protocol. Lance Corporal Bennett is receiving similar recognition, Major Crawford assured him. He has been commended for his exceptional judgment and professionalism under unusual circumstances. His willingness to adapt traditional protocols to meet a modern security threat has been noted at the highest levels of military command. Over. The next hour, Jake learned details about the investigation that amazed him. The network Mitchell had been working with had been planning their attacks for over a year. They had been systematically gathering intelligence about security procedures at multiple locations, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. Your recognition of Mitchell's surveillance equipment was crucial, one of the officials explained. Most people, even most security personnel, wouldn't have identified those devices as readily as you did. Your combat experience made the difference. As the meeting concluded, Colonel Harrison stood and extended his hand to Jake. Staff Sergeant Thompson, you have brought honor to yourself, your corps, and your country. More importantly, you have strengthened the bonds between our two nations through your professionalism and courage. Jake shook the colonel's hand still, struggling to believe everything that had happened. Thank you, sir. I just did what I thought was right. That, Colonel Harrison replied with a smile, is exactly what makes a good soldier. As Jake left the office, he found Bennett waiting in the corridor, wearing the same stunned expression that Jake was sure was on his own face. Well? Bennett asked, how did it go? Jake couldn't help but grin. I think we might have just made history, Bennett. Good, Bennett replied, returning the smile. I was getting tired of just standing around looking pretty for the tourists. 3 months later, Jake returned to the United States with more than just memories of his time in London. He carried with him a deeper understanding of military cooperation, a lasting friendship with soldiers from another nation, and the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing, even when it breaks the rules, can make all the difference in the world. The incident at Buckingham Palace became a case study in military academies on both sides of the Atlantic, an example of how training, instinct, and courage can combine to prevent tragedy. But for Jake, the most important lesson was simpler. Good soldiers, regardless of what flag they serve under, will always recognize and support each other when it matters most.